After the conclusion of the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union were working together in defeating the Axis powers. However, post-war tensions became apparent, specifically between the years 1947 through 1991. These 45 years of stress and fear of the unknown became classified as the Cold War. The Cold War was a time where the conflicts between the two nations would threaten the safety of the world. The possibility of nuclear warfare was a very serious and plausible threat that weighed heavily on the minds of Americans and Soviets, specifically in the year 1962. While the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, it was during this time of fear and anxiety that the Soviet Union and the United States had to find a compromise to ensure the safety of their people and the dignity of their country. The strain between the United States and the Soviet Union that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis began in 1949, when the United States had heard of a plan composed by the Soviet Union to help East Germany spread communism. With the U.S. were a part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. NATO was designed to help prevent the spread of communism. A country who opposed NATO was the Soviet Union. Their premier, Nikita Khrushchev, believed in a communist government and was a threat to the treaty's plan to extinguish communism. Cuba became involved with the conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union when Fidel Castro, the Prime Minister of Cuba, came to power in 1959. The United States was fearful of Castro installing another communist government in Cuba. Castro befriended the United States' main enemy, the Soviet Union. To further the attempts to destroy Castro's communistic leadership style, the U.S. decided to put in place a plan to invade Cuba with 1,400 trained Cuban exiles, overthrow the government, and finally assassinate Fidel Castro, known as the Bay of Pigs. When information of the invasion was leaked, Cuba asked the Soviet Union for help. The swamp-like conditions, along with Cuban preparations for the attack, led to the United States' failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Meanwhile, in Cuba, after the successful dissolution of the invasion, even stronger ties were made with the Soviet Union, which put additional strain on the United States and Cuba. The Soviet Union agreed to install missiles to help defend Cuba. This was seen as a form of revenge against the United States for the U.S. placing their missiles in Turkey. After realizing the United States would remain resilient and continue trying to put an end to Castro's government style, Fidel Castro made the ultimate declaration against the United States when he declared himself a communist, stating, "The United States made me one," December 2nd, 1961. The tensions continued to rise on October 14th, 1962, when an American spy plane flew over Cuba and took photographs of apparent missile sites built by the Soviet Union. The United States was dismayed upon hearing of these sites and became increasingly cautious of the Soviet Union and Cuba's intentions. 2 days later, on October 16, 1962, United States President John F. Kennedy was informed that in 10 days, these missiles would be completely operational and threaten the safety of the United States. Seeking guidance, he called together the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM. An influential person who took part in this group is President Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. EXCOM decided that the presence of these missiles was not acceptable. However, they were fearful that the missiles would be detonated if they did not approach the proposition of their removal carefully. Robert Kennedy strongly suggested the invasion. A transcriber from his meeting directly quotes Robert Kennedy as saying, "You put out all of the missiles. This isn't the end. This is the beginning." Despite Robert Kennedy's objections, President Kennedy finally made his decision to enforce a military blockade on Cuba on October 22, 1962. President Kennedy informed the American public with a broadcasted speech where he said,
"My fellow citizens, this government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
These new missile sites are capable of striking Washington, D.C. and any other city in the southeastern part of the United States. Their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace. After informing the American citizens, President Kennedy wrote a direct telegram to Khrushchev demanding the removal of weapons in Cuba and to cease sending further weapons. On October 23, 1962, Premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, responded to Kennedy's announcement in a letter saying, "You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather issuing an ultimatum." Going on to state, "I cannot agree with this, and I think that deep inside you will admit that I am right." Despite reading this letter, the United States was in deliberation of what their next course of action would be. On October 24th, the United States enforced the blockade. The anxiety dramatically rose as a Soviet Union ship that was boarded with missiles approached the 500-mile blockade zone. The United States Navy assigned to watch the blockade anxiously waited to see the outcome. When it appeared as though the ships would not cease their progression toward the blockade, they prepared a naval strike. Suddenly, the 20 ships that were nearest to the blockade zone abruptly stopped. The Navy guards waited apprehensively, keeping a close eye on the Soviet ships. Then, with a great relief, the Soviet ships began to retreat. The United States Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, stated, "It was eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked." However, the success of the United States pushing Soviet ships to retreat was short-lived when aerial shots of Cuba showed a rapid increase of missile bases. The United States was taken aback by this information, realizing that the problem was still not resolved. On October 25, 1962, Nikita Khrushchev wrote a letter to John F. Kennedy. "Your rockets are stationed in Britain and in Italy and pointed at us. You are worried over Cuba. You say that it worries you because it lies at a distance of 90 miles away from the shores of the United States. You have stationed devastating rocket weapons, which you call offensive, in Turkey, literally right next to us." He used this line in his speech to propose a compromise. He promised to pull the missiles out of Cuba if the United States removed the missiles from Turkey. On October 26, President Kennedy met with the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. It was during this meeting when Kennedy learned that Khrushchev declared he would dismantle all missiles in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union in exchange for extraction of United States missiles in Turkey and a pledge not to invade Cuba. Not wanting to increase tensions, Robert Kennedy suggested that John F. Kennedy refuse a military retaliation against Cuba and strongly advised that the president accepts the terms proposed by Khrushchev. The president followed through with Robert's suggestions by writing a telegram to Khrushchev, stating his only request was that Khrushchev gave him time to talk to the Turkish commander, Cemal Gürsel. Nikita Khrushchev began removing the missiles immediately from Cuba after hearing the United States agreement to his compromise. However, the missiles in Turkey were not removed until April of 1963. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a perfect example of conflict and compromise. Without the United States and Soviet Union's ability to communicate effectively and agree to a compromise, the world would have been faced with a nuclear war with a devastating consequence. Because of communication and compromise, millions of lives were saved. The ways John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev compromised to solve the detrimental conflicts in the Cuban Missile Crisis is a prime example of how two powerful leaders can work together to resolve a conflict peacefully.